Welcome to our deep dive today. This time we're tackling childhood trauma and its impact, and I think a lot of you listening are probably here because you're trying to get a better grasp on how those early experiences can shape us, even without us realizing it sometimes. We've got a really interesting set of sources for this deep dive. Academic studies, expert opinions, and even personal stories. So we're going to try to paint a full picture. This
Yeah,
complex topic of childhood trauma, it really gets you thinking, how much those early years affect our brains and our behavior later in life, even after we've, grown up.
yeah, absolutely. It is fascinating. For so long, psychology really focused on those big one-time, traumatic events, stuff like you see with PTSD. But the stuff we're looking at today,
Hmm.
it really seems like the field is shifting more and more towards what happens when that trauma is ongoing,
Mm-hmm.
especially early on in life,
Hmm.
especially in those crucial caregiving relationships.
So, okay, we're talking about way more than just a single scary event, right? This is repeated long-term exposure to these difficult or even straight up dangerous situations. Yeah, I can see how that would have a way deeper and longer lasting impact,
Mm.
especially on, a developing mind.
Exactly. And one of the most significant discoveries about all this came from a study they did over at Cambridge Hospital. They were studying patients with borderline personality disorder, BPD. They found something totally unexpected, a link between BPD and early childhood trauma. Can you imagine? They found that 81% of these patients reported having experienced severe abuse or neglect in childhood,
Huh?
often starting before they even turned 7.
81%. Wow, that's a huge number. It really hits you that this isn't just some random thing. And I was reading about John Bowlby, that famous attachment theorist. He argued that kids who show a lot of anger or guilt or even fear of abandonment, they aren't just acting out for no reason. These behaviors might actually be coming from their early life experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bowlby's work was groundbreaking. He said instead of looking at those behaviors as inherently bad, or flawed, we got to see them as reactions to real trauma that they've lived through. It's not some internal, flaw. It's often a reflection of what's happening in their world.
And this kind of leads us to another groundbreaking study. I bet you've heard of it.
If
ACE study.
Right, the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences. And I remember it being pretty massive in scope. They studied a ton of people, and what they found was really eye-opening about how common these adverse experiences really are,
Yeah.
even in what seemed like totally normal families.
Exactly. Get this, two-thirds of the people they studied said they'd been through at least one ACE. And a full quarter had experienced repeated physical abuse. And what's really crazy is that this wasn't just people, living in poverty or neglect. This was people from all walks of life, even well-off families. Really challenged that idea that ACEs only happen in certain, troubled environments. So we're talking physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, having a parent with mental health problems or substance abuse issues. It's kind of sobering to think how many people have been through at least one of these. And I remember they came up with this ACE score, right? Where they actually added up the different types of adverse experiences someone had gone through.
Yeah, and the higher their score, the more likely they were to experience a whole bunch of negative stuff later in life.
Yeah.
We're talking learning problems, depression,
Hmm.
addiction, even chronic health issues.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a correlation. This study showed a real link between higher ACE scores and things like higher rates of unemployment, lower income.
So it's not just mental and emotional well-being, it affects their physical health, their economic situation later on. Really shows how those early experiences can have a huge impact down the road. And to make it even more complicated, the study also found that these ACEs almost never happen alone, right? You might have a parent who's struggling with addiction that leads to emotional neglect, maybe even witnessing violence at home. All that together would have a huge impact on a kid.
Yeah, you've hit on a really important point there. The effects of these experiences, they build up over time, meaning that they can affect someone on a whole bunch of different levels. It's really about seeing the total effect of all those different stressors rather than just zeroing in on single events.
Makes you wonder how we can even start to help someone heal when they've been through so much. I mean, these negative ways of coping, like with obesity or addiction, those are actually how a person is dealing with all the fallout from trauma.
Mhm.
How do we even start to help them find better, healthier ways to deal with all that?
Such a good question, and one that the ACE study actually touches on a bit. There's this one story from a patient who struggled with overeating. She explained that for her, overweight is overlooked, and that's how she needed to be. It's heartbreaking, but it shows you something really deep about how trauma can lead to behaviors that look unhealthy, but they actually give that person a sense of safety, of control. when they've been through so much.
That's a powerful way to look at it. I guess it means we got to approach these issues with way more compassion and understanding. It's not about judging how someone copes, but trying to understand what they're going through, what they're trying to protect themselves from.
Exactly. And that brings us to talking about this proposed diagnosis. You might find this interesting. It's called developmental trauma disorder, or DTD.
DTD. Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
Well, DTD came about because we needed a diagnosis that really captures how childhood trauma, that ongoing exposure we've been talking about, how it can totally mess with someone's development.
So it's bigger than just individual symptoms. It looks at the whole, the long-term consequences
Yeah.
of that early trauma.
Exactly. And the experts who came up with DTD, they noticed some things that pop up in kids who've been through chronic trauma. Things like trouble controlling their emotions, problems paying attention or concentrating, trouble forming healthy relationships, and just this feeling of being broken or damaged.
It's like they're always on edge, like they're waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Their brains are wired for survival, not for connection or emotional growth.
That's a great way to put it. Like their nervous system is stuck in overdrive, even when there's no danger. And this highlights how important it is to understand how trauma early on in life actually shapes the brain as it's developing.
Okay, so let's talk about the brain. I mean, we keep coming back to it, but how does all this actually play out in our brains? Does early trauma really change the structure of our brains?
It sure does. There's some really cool research with rat pups, where they found that how much nurturing a pup gets in those first few hours of life actually changes the chemistry of its brain for good. It changes how they respond to stress their whole lives.
Wow, so even something like physical touch and comfort can have these huge lasting effects on how the brain develops. Shows you how important those early caregiving experiences really are.
Absolutely. And we see similar patterns in human studies, too. There's this field called epigenetics, which is a fancy way of saying our experiences can actually change how our genes work.
Hold on, our experiences change our genes. That's pretty wild.
I know, right? It's like our environment can switch things on or off in our DNA. Researchers have found that things like social factors, including abuse in childhood, can have a big impact on gene expression and long-term health outcomes.
So it's not just about how we feel or think. It's about how our bodies actually function at like a cellular level. This is getting pretty deep.
It is. It makes us rethink a lot of our assumptions about nature versus nurture. It's not one or the other, it's both. They're always interacting
Yeah,
and shaping each other.
it's fascinating. But it also raises questions for me. Like, if these early experiences get so ingrained, how do we even begin to address them later in life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't
Yeah.
it? For a long time, people thought the talking tour was the main way to deal with trauma. The idea being, if you could just talk about it, process it, you could move on.
Yeah.
But turns out, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Right. And I think we need to break down this whole talking cure idea a little more. I'm curious about how our understanding of traumatic memory has changed over time.
Okay, so this is where things get really interesting. So you're saying that talking about trauma isn't always enough to, like, get over it.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Right. Talking is important, but it's not like the whole story.
Right.
Like, you break a bone and all you do is talk about how it happened. You got to set the bone,
Yeah.
to give it time to heal properly.
That's a good way to put it. So what are we missing then? What else needs to happen besides just talking about it?
One big thing is understanding how traumatic memory actually works. It's not always neat and tidy and like linear like our everyday memories are. Traumatic memories are often fragmented, sensory-based, almost like a bunch of snapshots or these really intense feelings that can just come flooding back out of nowhere.
So you're saying that someone might not even remember exactly what happened, but they still feel the emotional and physical stuff like it was happening all over again.
Exactly. And these memories can be triggered by all sorts of things you see or hear, smells, even certain thoughts or emotions. And when that happens, it can be totally overwhelming, even if the person's perfectly safe in that moment.
That makes a lot of sense. And in the stuff you share, there's this really powerful story about a woman named Nancy who experienced something called anesthesia awareness during surgery.
Oh yeah, Nancy's story. That's a tough one. It really shows how traumatic memory can stick with someone even way after the actual event. For those who don't know, anesthesia awareness is when someone wakes up during surgery, but they can't move or talk. It's terrifying.
Oh yeah, totally terrifying. And Nancy's story really shows how long and complicated the journey of healing from trauma can be. She talked about the terror, that feeling of being trapped in her own body, and the long struggle to feel safe again, to trust the world again.
What's amazing about her story, though, is that it shows that healing is possible. She found ways to calm her nervous system, manage her triggers, and take back control of her life through therapy and stuff like Pilates.
So she had to like rebuild her relationship with her own body, relearn how to feel safe and like grounded in the present.
Exactly. And that brings us back to those 4 key areas for recovery that we talked about before. Remember, calming the mind and body, learning to deal with triggers, being present in life, and living honestly without hiding from yourself.
And in part one, we started looking at how those negative ways of coping you mentioned, like with obesity or addiction, those might actually be ways of managing those very things. It's not about judging, but about understanding what needs those behaviors might be meeting.
Right. And you made a great point about those early traumas shaping not just our minds, but our bodies too. We talked about epigenetics and how those baby rats who got more nurturing actually changed their brain chemistry and how they deal with stress.
Yeah. And if you think about human studies, we see how things like childhood abuse can actually change our DNA. It affects our physical health, our mental well-being. It's amazing and scary all at the same time.
It really shows us how crucial it is to prevent trauma from happening in the first place. But for those who have experienced it, understanding these changes in the body can be a first step.
Yeah.
It's not about blame. It's about realizing that those experiences changed you deeply. And now you have the power to change yourself.
I like that, change yourself. It means we have a choice, that we're not just victims of our past.
Exactly. And that's where those 4 areas to recovery come in. They give us a roadmap for how to start taking control, rebuilding trust, becoming resilient.
Okay, so let's dive back into those 4 areas. The first one was calming and focusing the mind and body. What are some things that people have found helpful for doing that?
Well, one thing that's become really popular is mindfulness. It's about learning to pay attention to what's happening right now without judgment. Noticing your thoughts and feelings without getting swept away by them.
Mindfulness, I've heard of it, but I always pictured like monks meditating on a mountaintop. Can anyone really do that?
Oh, you definitely don't have to be a monk. It's really a skill that you can build through everyday stuff. It could be as simple as paying attention to your breath, noticing how your feet feel on the ground,
Yeah.
or even just really enjoying each bite of food.
So it's not just sitting there meditating, it's about being aware in your everyday life. That I can actually do. What about for people who need a little more structure? Are there like guided mindfulness exercises or something?
Tons of them. Apps like Calm and Headspace have guided meditations for all levels, beginners to people who've been doing it for years. You can find guided meditations on YouTube too, or just search for mindfulness exercises online.
Awesome. I'm going to check those out. And since we're talking about resources, we talked a bit about somatic therapy earlier. How would someone go about finding a therapist who does that?
You can search online directories like the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute or the Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute. Lots of therapists list their specialties on their websites too, so you can search for like somatic therapy plus your city or state.
And since we're on the topic of therapy in general, it's worth saying that finding the right therapist can take time. It's about finding someone you feel comfortable with, someone who gets trauma, and who's worked with people who've been through similar stuff.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to try out a few different therapists
Yeah.
before you settle on one. It's a big decision, and you got to find someone who feels right for you.
It's like finding the right pair of shoes. Might take a few tries, but when you find the one that fits, it's a game changer. And while we're talking about taking care of ourselves, let's talk about those triggers. You mentioned grounding techniques before. I'm curious to hear more about those.
Grounding techniques are like a first aid kit for your nervous system. They help you snap out of those intense feelings and come back to the present moment where you're safe. We talked about the 5-4-3-2-1 method, which is great for using all your senses. But there are so many other grounding techniques out there.
Yeah, like what? Give me some examples.
Okay, well, you could try holding something cold, like an ice cube, or splashing cold water on your face. That sudden temperature change can pull you out of that fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
Or you could focus on your breath. Take slow, deep breaths and count each inhale and each exhale. You can even just press your feet into the floor and really feel how your weight sinks into the ground.
I like those. Simple but effective. It's like having tools you can use anytime, anywhere to get back in control. And you mentioned breathing earlier. Any specific breathing techniques you recommend for dealing with those really strong emotions?
We talked about box breathing, which is good for calming down. But another good one is called diaphragmatic breathing, or belly breathing. You basically breathe deep into your belly, let it expand with each inhale, then slowly exhale and let your belly fall. This kind of breathing helps activate the vagus nerve, which is involved in regulating your heart rate, your digestion, your mood.
So it's not just about getting more oxygen, it's about telling your brain it's okay to relax.
You got it. And even beyond those specific techniques, it's important to remember that sometimes taking care of yourself means saying no to things that might trigger you or overwhelm you. You don't have to push yourself. It's okay to take breaks, ask for help, and put your own well-being first.
That's a good reminder for all of us, especially those of us who are always putting everyone else's needs before our own. Sometimes saying no is the kindest thing you can do for yourself and the people around you.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the third part of recovery, being present and engaged in life. Trauma can steal your joy, your sense of purpose, your ability to connect with others and really live life to the fullest. So it's about finding ways to get those things back, to rediscover what makes you come alive, what gives your life meaning, what makes you feel connected to something bigger than yourself.
So it's like rebuilding your life from scratch, brick by brick, finding those things that make you feel truly alive.
Exactly. And it's not always easy. It might mean facing those painful memories, admitting how you've been coping, and eventually finding a way to forgive yourself for the things you did to survive.
Because we all make mistakes, especially when we're hurting. And sometimes the best thing we can do is be kind to ourselves, forgive ourselves, the same way we would with someone we love.
You got it. And it's also about seeing your own strength, how resilient you've been in the face of all that, and honoring the path you've been on. Even with all the ups and downs, healing from trauma, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about learning to live with more awareness, more compassion, more acceptance for yourself and for others.
Wow, it's hard to believe we're already at the last part of our deep dive into childhood trauma. We've talked about so much, from how trauma changes the brain to understanding those not so healthy ways people cope. And now I'm really interested in hearing more about those tools, those strategies that people can use to move towards healing, to reclaim their lives.
It has been quite a journey. And you're right, we spent a lot of time understanding how complex trauma really is. Now I think we can focus on those empowering steps, things anyone listening can try to move towards a place of wholeness. Remember those 4 key areas: calming the mind and body, managing those sneaky triggers, re-engaging with life, and living honestly without hiding from yourself. Let's break those down with some practical tips and techniques.
Okay, that sounds good to me. And I bet a lot of people listening are really interested in that first one, calming the mind and body. You mentioned mindfulness earlier, and to be honest, that's something I struggle with. My mind just goes a mile a minute, and sitting still to meditate feels impossible. Any tips for those of us who are, let's say, mindfulness challenged?
Well, first of all, know that you're not alone. Lots of people feel that way. It's totally normal. Remember, mindfulness isn't about clearing your mind or reaching some blissed out state. It's just about noticing what's happening inside you, around you, with this kind of gentle curiosity. It's like working a muscle. The more you do it, the easier it gets.
Okay, that does take some of the pressure off.
Yeah.
So besides traditional meditation, what are some other ways to build that mindfulness muscle?
You could try putting little mindful moments into your everyday routine. For example, when you're brushing your teeth,
Mm.
really focus on how it feels. The taste of the toothpaste, the brush on your teeth, the sound of the water. Or when you're walking, pay attention to your feet on the ground, the rhythm of your steps, the sights and sounds around you.
So it's about being present even when you're doing normal everyday stuff? I can actually do that.
What about people who need a little more guidance? Are there guided mindfulness exercises or so?
Yeah, there are tons. Apps like Calm and Headspace have guided meditations for everyone, from beginners to people who've been doing it forever. You can find them on YouTube too, or just search for mindfulness exercises online.
Perfect. I'm going to check those out.
Mm.
And speaking of resources, we talked a bit about somatic therapy. If someone wanted to explore that, how would they find a therapist who does that?
You can start by looking at online directories, like the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute or the Sensorimotor Psychotherapy Institute. A lot of therapists also list their specialties on their websites, so you can search for somatic therapy, plus your city or state.
And since we're talking about therapy in general, finding the right therapist can be tough. It really comes down to finding someone you feel comfortable with, someone who understands trauma and has worked with people who've had similar experiences to yours. Right. Don't be afraid to try out a few different therapists before you choose one. It's a big decision. You need to find someone who feels like the right fit.
Like finding the right pair of shoes. Might take a few tries, but when you find the one that works, it makes all the difference. So while we're talking about taking care of ourselves, let's get back to those triggers. You mentioned grounding techniques. Tell me more about those.
Grounding techniques are like a first aid kit for when your nervous system freaks out. They help you shift your focus away from those overwhelming feelings, back to the present, where you're safe, We talked about that 5-4-3-2-1 method, which uses all your senses. But there are a bunch of other grounding techniques out there too.
Oh yeah, like what? What are some examples?
Well, you could try holding something cold, like an ice cube, or splashing cold water on your face. That sudden temperature change can really help snap you out of that fight or flight response. You could also try focusing on your breath. Take those slow, deep breaths, counting each inhale and exhale. Or even just press your feet into the ground and feel that connection. Feel your weight sinking down.
Those are great. Simple and effective, like having a set of tools to use anytime you need to get back in control. And you mentioned breathing before. Any particular breathing techniques you'd suggest for dealing with those really strong emotions?
When we talked about box breathing, which is great for calming down, but another good one is called diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing. You basically breathe deep into your belly. Let it expand with each inhale. And then slowly exhale, letting your belly fall. This type of breathing helps stimulate the vagus nerve, which helps control your heart rate, your digestion, even your mood.
So it's not just about getting more oxygen, it's about sending a signal to your brain that, hey, it's okay to relax.
Exactly. And beyond all these techniques, it's important to remember that sometimes self-care means saying no. Saying no to things that might be triggering or overwhelming. You don't have to push yourself past your limits. It's okay to take breaks, to ask for help, and to put your own well-being first.
That's such an important message, especially for those of us who are always putting other people's needs before our own. Sometimes saying no is the kindest thing you can do for yourself and the people you care about.
I totally agree. And that brings us to that third part of recovery, being present and engaged in life. Trauma can really steal your joy, your sense of purpose. It can make it hard to connect with others and really experience life. So it's about finding ways to get those things back, to rediscover what makes you come alive, what gives you meaning, what makes you feel connected to something bigger.
It's like rebuilding your life from scratch, finding those things that make you feel truly alive.
Exactly. And it's not always easy. It might mean facing those painful memories, being honest about how you've been coping, and in the end, finding a way to forgive yourself for the things you did just to survive.
Because we all make mistakes, especially when we're hurting. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is forgive ourselves, just like we would forgive someone we love.
Absolutely. And it's also about recognizing your own strength,
Yeah.
how resilient you've been through all of that, and honoring the path you've been on, even with all the ups and downs. Healing from trauma, it's a journey, not a destination. It's about learning to live with more awareness, more compassion, more acceptance for yourself and for everyone.
That's beautifully put. You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this question. How can we build a society that does a better job of supporting kids and families to prevent this trauma from happening in the first place? It's a big question, but I think it's one we need to be asking ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. It starts with creating safe and nurturing environments for all children, giving them access to good mental health care, and addressing those bigger issues: poverty, inequality, discrimination, all those things that contribute to trauma.
It's about making a world where every child feels seen and heard and valued, where they have the support they need to thrive, not just survive. Because healing from trauma isn't just about each person recovering on their own. It's about making a world that's more just and compassionate for everyone.
I love that. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something and that it gave you some hope. Remember, healing is possible. There's always hope.
And if you're struggling, please know that you're not alone. There are people who care, there are resources out there, and there's a whole community of people who are here to support you on your journey towards healing and wholeness. Keep going, keep reaching out, and never ever give up on yourself.